From the Toronto Star, I'm Adrian Chung, and this matters. Hey, it's Adrian. So this is a bit of an unusual start to our episodes, especially if you're a regular listener of This Matters. After 2 years of co-hosting and producing this podcast, this will be my last episode on the show. Getting to be your host, asking questions of decision makers and people in the know, helping make a bit of sense of the world beyond the headlines and reactionary moments, especially in the middle of a once-in-a-lifetime pandemic, has been the most rewarding work of my journalism career. Thank you for giving time to this podcast, for joining our community of listeners. You know, I've always thought of podcasting as a very intimate medium where my voice is quite literally in your ear. So thank you for trusting me to deliver the news and hopefully some interesting conversations to you. And thank you for supporting the Toronto Star, home to some of the best journalists and reporters in Canada, many of them lending their voices to this show. And of course, I'm just one limb on the growing tree that is This Matters. The podcast continues on and is in very capable hands with my co-hosts Saba and Raju and the brilliant team behind it. Hope to talk to you all again soon. But enough with all the mushy stuff. Here's our episode today.
Now she gets the bell. She's still a little high in the track. She's going to dive down now and put it on the full gas.
Kelsey Mitchell, Canadian sprint cyclist, flies around the oval track on the world's biggest stage, the Tokyo Olympics.
A reminder that Mitchell, if she wins this, she will take the gold medal. She has the lead in this best of three. She's got to keep the track there. She's got to keep that bike in that track. Will Mitchell hold on? She does. It's a gold for Kelsey Mitchell of Canada.
Mitchell made history.
Wow, second gold medal ever for Canada in cycling.
Years of blood, sweat, and tears? Absolutely. You don't get there without the grind. But Mitchell didn't train for it all her life. She became a gold medalist just 5 years after starting the sport. Mitchell was part of a training program for Canadian athletes who have a potential to compete in the Olympic Games. Most pro athletes work their way through the sports system early in life, through development, playing against tougher competition, traveling, dedicating their life to making it. But this program is a bit of reverse engineering. It focuses on the talents and the abilities of the athletes first, and then it connects them to an Olympic sport that they can be really good at. And often, it's a sport they've never tried or even thought about. On This Matters, we're joined by Kerry Gillespie, sports reporter and member of the Toronto Star editorial board. We'll take you behind the lab that is finding diamonds in the rough of Canadian athletes and turning them into world-class Olympians. Kerry, nice to talk to you. Thanks for making the time.
Thanks. It's nice to be here.
You've covered sports in this country for a long time, and you've pointed out that the attention, perhaps the interest, certainly the funding of some sports, is not equal across the board in this country. What makes it difficult for athletes to maybe find and be part of certain Olympic sports, you think?
Well, I think there's a couple different things. Athletes inherit a lot from their parents, and not just kind of the genetic makeup that, predisposes them to some sports. It's what they're exposed to at home. So what's on television at home? Do the parents watch hockey? Do they watch, alpine skiing? So that's a big chunk of it, what they watch and what the parents expose them to when they're kids. Do they put them in hockey? Do they put them in soccer? Or do they go cross-country skiing every weekend as a family? There's, a lot of kids gravitate to the school sports because they're the easiest. Families have a lot going on. There's not always time to put kids into extracurricular sports. So, in our schools, we play rugby, we play soccer. Some schools have swimming teams, but, not many have, short track figure skating or those kinds of sports. So that's a big chunk of it. Access is a really big thing in Canada. We don't even have the facilities for many of these Olympic sports. There's no ski jumping facility. There's no long track oval in most communities. So even if you had an interest in that sport, getting to try it in Canada is really hard. And then money is a big deal always.
Right. Of whether or not these programs are funded and there's scouting of certain athletes, I would imagine.
Yeah. And at the young level, I mean, if you're a family with a couple kids, putting your kids in sports is really expensive. And some of these sports are a lot more expensive than others. You know, you can find a community soccer program that's quite affordable. You can't find, you know, a snowboard team or a cycling team that is as affordable. And the amount of time it takes to get to, if you live in downtown Toronto, getting to the mountain every weekend, you know, that's a big commitment too.
So the RBC Training Centre, what is it exactly, and how might it be used to close that gap of pairing off really great athletes to maybe lesser known sports?
So it's a talent identification program, and it started in 2016, and it's for athletes who are 14 to 25. So it's got quite a big range. And they basically invite them to come and test. And then if they do well, they move up to a national, and then there's a final. So the broad idea is to match athletes with a certain set of skills, sometimes skills the athletes themselves don't even know they have, to sports that need those particular skills. So, I mean, I've called it kind of a matchmaking system. It's sort of, you know, it's kind of like speed dating for sport. But instead of, you know, questions about, you know, do you like walks on the beach? It's about testing. So they match athletes with sports based on a series of physical tests that suggest that athlete might have a predisposition to do that sport.
So what kind of tests are we talking about here? Endurance, or is it strength? What are they putting athletes through to test them?
Right. So there's a series of tests, and they're all looking for different things because the sports that are recruiting through the program want different things. So there's endurance tests, power tests, speed tests, and strength tests. So on the two sort of ends, the 6-second bike is the sprint test. So that's, you know, you're on a stationary bike from a standstill, pedal as fast as you can for 6 seconds. It sounds kind of easy, but it's not. And the power that some athletes are able to produce suggests that they're going to be really good at sports that you start from a standstill and you've got to like fly off the line. So, you know, in speed
explosiveness.
Yeah. Speed skating or sprint cycling, you know, you start from a standstill and you got to go. And then at the other end, there's the endurance test, which is the arm leg bike. It's more for sports. It shows sort of an aerobic capacity and an ability to maintain your power. So in something like paddling or rowing, they don't just want you to be explosive off the first, you know, couple strokes. You've got to maintain that for quite a distance and not lose power as you go. So those are kind of two totally different tests, and there's some others.
And it also sounds like depending on the sport, depending on the age, they're not just looking for one particular type of athlete. It's a pretty wide spectrum in terms of ages, in terms of abilities. It really depends on the sport and what's required of that athlete.
Yeah. And the sports are, by and large, these are sports that don't have a massive pool of athletes getting into it for all the reasons we've already talked about. So they're trying to increase their development side, and they're looking for sports or for athletes. And this way, they're not just sort of putting an ad out and saying, hey, athletes, come to us. This makes it more likely that the athletes that are coming actually have the set of skills that they need to do well at the sport.
Does it almost give some athletes a second shot at the highest level of competition? I mean, you know, sure, there may be some players that might not end up being a pro hockey player, but they could be an Olympic athlete in something completely different that maybe they didn't train for before.
Yeah, there are for sure a lot of athletes that are almost second career athletes. So they're people who've played a particular sport. They've hit the limit to what they can do in that sport. In some cases, they've had injuries and, you know, that sport's no longer an option, or they just weren't getting to the top level in that sport. And then but they want to be an athlete. And, you know, they love the life. They, you know, want to get to the Olympics. And for some of them, this is not for everyone, but for the lucky ones, I suppose, and the talented ones, yeah, this can be another chance at finding a sport that probably could argue you were better suited to in the first place. And then you can find some success.
We'll be right back. When we're talking about the infrastructure of sport in Canada, how does a program like this support athletes or maybe give them that shot at Olympics or at World Championships to be in some of these sports that they didn't consider before, or athletes that might be familiar, but it creates more of an infrastructure. How do you think it does that?
It's called a talent identification and funding program. So it does provide some funding. The athletes who make it through the regionals and the finals and then sort of get chosen at the end, there's 30 of them, and they benefit from $7,500 of funding for at least 2 years, which isn't nothing, but it's not an enormous amount. It doesn't go to the athlete directly. It goes to the sport, and they use it for coaching, for nutrition, for travel, for equipment. But given the high cost of sport and high performance sport, that doesn't go far. I mean, the athletes who want to make a go of this and who get chosen and who are, matched up with a sport are looking at spending probably tens of thousands of their own dollars to try to make their Olympic dream come true. So, I mean, I would argue this program is much more about the matchmaking service, about connecting an athlete to a sport they might not have thought of, making them feel sort of confident and welcomed by that sport. It sort of shortcuts what might be a much longer route. But the money itself is, this is not an all expenses paid trip to the Olympics.
Yeah, funding remains a big issue in many sports, but especially, again, not the super well-funded sports of basketball or soccer or hockey, the most popular ones, of course.
Yeah, amateur sport. I'm not sure there's any discipline or any sport that has enough money in this country.
In your reporting, I thought it was interesting that this program and the idea of it, it's not just hypothetical, that there are already Canadian athletes who, through this model, have become Olympians for Team Canada. Can you tell us about their stories?
Yeah. This last Summer Olympics that we just had in Tokyo, they're sort of the training grounds kind of most famous face is Kelsey Mitchell, who was a cyclist and won a gold medal. She won Canada's last gold medal in Tokyo in sprint cycling. And she came to the program in 2017. She'd been a soccer player in Alberta, and she'd never, there's not an indoor velodrome in Alberta. So biking was not something she had thought of. She didn't own a bike at the time, but she did that 6-second bike that we talked about, the sprint, and Cycling Canada was thrilled with her results and so recruited her. And she, within 2 years of being recruited, had already set a world record in sprint cycling. And then at the Olympics, she won gold. I mean, it's a spectacular rise. And then the winter version would be Marion Thénault. She was also recruited in 2017, and she was a gymnast. She was about to graduate from high school and had been a gymnast since she was 3 years old and was coming to the end, didn't see a future in it, had enough of gymnastics. So at her sports school, they had a note from the RBC training ground and saying, this is available, come try out. And so she went. And in her case, the tests are not predictive of whether, she can jump off into the air and do a whole bunch of flips before landing on skis. But her gymnastics background is very important. And so aerial skiing had a coach at the training ground and talked to her and liked her attitude. And then they had her come do trampoline training and water ramp training. And she had a similar rise as Kelsey did. So she was on her first World Cup season last year, and she finished third overall. She won a gold medal. And now she's 21 and she'll sort of lead the team heading to Beijing.
It's incredible that she is going to be competing there, because she was also saying too that when she was first getting introduced to aerial skiing, she had to look up on YouTube what this thing even was. Yeah.
A lot of athletes they really want to be athletes. And so when they offered her sort of an opportunity and said, hey, would you like to come do this? She's like, oh yeah, I'll totally do that. And then she had to go look it up because she had no idea what aerial skiing was. I mean, she had in the back of her mind a kind of maybe, but wasn't too sure about the difference between ski jumping and aerial skiing and moguls. But, she was keen and then looked it up and went, oh, wow, that's kind of crazy. But it clearly was no problem for her. And when she had been a gymnast, she was very good in the air, her air sense. So the skill piece that she had from gymnastics translated really well in a way that it didn't work out for her in gymnastics, but it has worked out for her in aerials.
Many Canadians, many people listening will remember "Own the Podium" as being a mantra at the 2010 Vancouver Olympics. I remember how in some quarters of Canadian sports, it was almost seen as a bit too chest-thumpy, maybe a little too aggressive to say that, Canada wanted to own the podium. Certainly, you've seen the sporting landscape around that over the last decade. How much has sporting infrastructure and funding changed since then, you think?
It's changed quite a bit. I mean, when Canada got the 2010 Olympics, there was a kind of a decision that Canada didn't want to be the nice guys who turn up. Canada wanted to win. The previous two Olympics that had happened in Canada and Montreal in 76 and 88 in Calgary, Canada was the only host nation that had not won a gold medal on home soil. So there was kind of like, never, not again. We will win in Vancouver. And so there was a huge attitude shift. Like, it wasn't enough to just turn up and be nice. Canada was going to win. And there was a ton of money that was put behind it. Heading into the Beijing quad, Own the Podium works in 4-year increments. They'll fund, it's about $88 million for the winter sports, and then another $17 million for the para winter sports going into Beijing. So there is a ton of money behind it. It is never enough, but the funding is far more significant. So, Canada made a decision. It wanted to win, and it was going to put some funding into it, and it has done that.
Right. And around amateur athletics, so much of our conversation has been around funding, that there's never enough for that, especially when it's not the most popular sport. Is that still sort of the gap to close over the next few years? Is it a funding problem? Is it a political will problem to get Canada to become, one of the top Olympic nations? Certainly we do pretty well in winter games consistently, but is that the big gap here still? Is it the money piece?
Maybe. Money is an issue. Canada has a lot of challenges that, some other countries don't have. It's enormous, for one. Basically, we have a lot of country and not a lot of people in the country. So the cost of running programs in Canada is much, much higher than it would be in some other places. And we also don't sort of specialize. Like, we don't sort of, Norway is a very small country, very small population. They do incredibly well in the Winter Olympics, but they do incredibly well in, a few Nordic disciplines. They really seem to focus. Whereas in Canada, we're not saying you can't be a soccer player, you can't be a ski jumper, in theory, you can be anything, but the funding for some of the sports are quite low. So if you want to do that, you're going to have to put a ton of your own money in. So for sure, more money money fixes many things, but I think it's more than just the money piece. There are challenges in figuring out how to run national programs over a country as big as ours. And then there's always the kind of battle between grassroots sport development, recreation, stuff that gets kids active, and then the high performance piece. They're two quite different, probably funding pools, because you're running programs quite differently for pulling people in at the grassroots. And that's a big issue in Canada as well. We talk a lot about the elite athletes, but we don't have enough kids playing sports to begin with. And that goes back to access and the funding. And so that's a big piece that also has to happen.
Kerry, it's great talking to you. Thanks so much for making the time to join us about this.
Thank you. You're welcome. Nice to talk to you.
And that is Kerry Gillespie, sports reporter for The Star and member of the Toronto Star editorial board. That's it for today. Thanks so much for listening. I'm your host, Adrian Chung. Our This Matters team is me, Adrian Chung, Brian Bradley, JP Fozo, Matt Hearn, Morgan Bachnick, Raju Mudar, Saba Aitazaz, and Sean Pattinen. Our music is by So Called, Mike DeAngelis, and Sean Pattinen. We want to hear what stories matter to you. Please send us your comments, questions, or ideas to thismatters@thestar.ca. Please consider supporting the journalism the Toronto Star newsroom does at thestar.com/subscribingmatters. And don't forget to subscribe to This Matters on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you listen to your favorite podcasts. Let's talk soon.